Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations. Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Community Church podcast. If you find today's episode hopeful and helpful, then please follow or subscribe and then rate and review so that more people can find the conversation. I want to share with all of you a really special conversation that I got to have with Milwaukee historian John Gurda. John's pretty much the go-to person for Milwaukee history and has a very impressive resume that includes an Emmy Award, books on bestseller lists, and multiple degrees, including a master's in cultural geography and an honorary Ph.D. John was willing to share his insight on the really challenging topic of race relations in Milwaukee. We talk about some of the historical reasons for the segregated nature of Milwaukee, what the civil rights movement looked like in Milwaukee, and how looking back at these historical things can help us learn and improve how we care for and love those who look different from us. Now, race is a really challenging topic that comes with a tremendous amount of weight and baggage. And my ask for you is that as you listen to our conversation, put politics to the side and listen with compassion and an open mind. This is my conversation with John Gurda. Well, I'm excited to welcome to the podcast local Milwaukee historian John Gurda. John's the author of 22 books, including The Making of Milwaukee, which was also the basis for an Emmy Award-winning documentary series. He also writes a local history column in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, has a bachelor's in English from Boston College, a master's in cultural geography, and an honorary Ph.D. from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Quite the resume. So thank you, John, for coming on to the podcast.
I'm glad to be here, John. Thanks for asking me.
Yeah. So I have to start off with, do you have a favorite story maybe from Milwaukee history?
It's pretty hard as far as stories go to resist the Great Bridge War of 1845. You have three founders, Byron Kilbourne, Solomon Juneau, and George Walker, who founded different sections of town, each of whom thought his side should be the dominant one. And George Walker was sort of a distant third because for a variety of reasons, including the fact that someone jumped his claim. But you have the east and west sides, Juneautown and Kilbournetown, kind of fighting it out for supremacy. And there was one warm night in 1845 when the west side cut off the east side's main bridge to the west, and they retaliated by cutting off the west side bridge to the south. So people were actually they were bloodying each other's noses, for the greater honor and glory of east and west sides. They finally realized they were scaring people away, so they joined forces as a city of Milwaukee back in 1846. So that's. And certainly other cities around the country, around the world, began as sort of rival settlements. But that fighting a bridge war in your early years is kind of it's a fairly dramatic, kind of start to an urban career.
Yeah, not the best footing to start off on.
No.
Is there a piece of Milwaukee history that you find really surprises people that they're kind of shocked to find out?
Yeah, I think the one that stands out is certainly people have some familiarity with Milwaukee's Germanism, the fact that we've been a beer capital for so long, and a lot of that's by virtue of all the advertising that breweries did. So that kind of cemented Milwaukee's image as the beer capital in the national consciousness. The one thing that surprises people a lot is that we were a socialist citadel for a very long time. Milwaukee elected its first socialist mayor back in 1910. And that was Emil Seidel, Dan Hohn followed 1916 to 1940, and then Frank Zeiler from 1948 to 1960. So for a period of 50 years between 1910 and 1960, for 38 of those years, Milwaukee had socialist mayors, and no city, even remotely close to Milwaukee's size, chose to follow down that path. And it was kind of a function of a lot of the German social currents, intellectual currents, that had been kind of transplanted here. It was a function of a huge working class population that was receptive to cries for a greater share of the wealth they created. And it was also great leadership. A guy named Victor Berger, who kind of ran the movement, and ran is pretty accurate. But they proved themselves to be, Frank Seidler, he said the term he used for Milwaukee socialists was evolutionary moderates. These were not revolutionary Marxists. So What they did was, they turned Milwaukee from what had been a relatively typical for that period, kind of a cesspool of graft and corruption, foul deeds in high places, which was kind of the American standard back in those years, into a model of good government. Dan Hone got himself on the cover of Time magazine back in 1936, and Time called Milwaukee perhaps the best governed city in the U.S. So they were exceptional administrators, exceptional governors, and they stood for the cooperative commonwealth. And they wanted a public enterprise, public funds to be used for the public good. I think that's kind of a no-brainer, but no, that's not necessarily the philosophy many people follow then or now. So that's a surprise, the fact that Milwaukee had socialists for so many years.
Yeah, I'm curious, did that, because they were kind of unique in that regard, did that impact their relationship with other like cities or even other, like, I know Chicago was probably forming pretty substantially there. Did that impact that relationship?
Not so much. Dan Hone was president for a time, one of the founders of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. So they played well with others. People
Gotcha.
who were in the same, dealing with the same problems. Trying to do some of the same kind of reforms. So no, we were not not marginalized.
Gotcha.
Not a pariah among cities. And Milwaukee was, in fact, especially during Hone's years. He was mayor for 24 years. During his period, Milwaukee won award after award as the safest, healthiest, and cleanest big city in the U.S. In the public health contest, Milwaukee won that so often that it had to be retired from competition to give other cities a chance. So
wow.
So yeah, so there was a sense that Milwaukee was in the ranks of U.S. cities, was doing it right and doing it well.
So you're telling me they learned from the bridge wars?
Yeah, right.
Well, I wonder if we can maybe transition into our conversation just about race and its impact in Milwaukee. You wrote a piece back in 2017, like talked about the segregated nature of Milwaukee. And I'd love to just ask you a little bit about a couple parts of that article. The first one, you just start off by asking the question, is there anything more difficult to write about than race?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's especially poignant today. Over your time as a historian, how have you found race to be a difficult topic to maybe talk about or discuss with others?
I think it's not just in the field of history, it's all fields. You begin with an entire people who came here in chains and kind of move up by fits and starts and with a great deal of struggle, to some, at least a semblance of parity in the larger world. That's a problematic relationship. And not just in the South, where slavery was the institution. So I think it's, these sensitivities, kind of especially in the field of history, as a white guy, kind of writing about Black history, there's some legitimate suspicion about whether or not I have, or someone in my position has the perspective to tell that story with accuracy. I think you're obligated to. Obviously, you're looking at the broad spectrum of an entire city's career. You got to talk about everybody who's here, but it remains a sensitivity. And as I said in that article, it's the first thing we notice, aside from gender. It's the first thing we notice. So it's kind of in America. There are other cities, I think, are Rochester. I've been in Rochester. Kansas City said to be pretty reasonably well integrated. But in most of the northern U.S. cities, the industrial cities, remain something of a troubled relationship, I guess is one way to put it.
You just mentioned that, being a white historian, there's that easy element of suspicion. Mm-hmm. Is there anything short of just kind of your work speaking for itself that helps navigate through that, or kind of prove that, no, you want to tell the true and accurate story?
I think you tell the story and try to be as fair as you possibly can. And as we've learned, later generations will look back on the work of earlier historians and say, whoa, that was way off base. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if somebody in 2123 kind of looks back and says, what was Gurda talking about? That's just the nature of things. That's how knowledge progresses. But I think, the most you can aspire to is to do the research accurately and tell the story fairly. And that's what I've tried to do over all these years.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that went into a lot of your piece when you wrote about the segregation, right? Trying to tell the story accurately, because in that piece, you mentioned that you really don't like the label that Milwaukee often gets presented with, which is most segregated city in the nation.
Right.
And you said it's because it reflects an incomplete, often knee-jerk understanding of race in Milwaukee, and because it's both demoralizing and unproductive. Would you mind just maybe expanding a little bit on why you believe that to be the case?
Sure. I think, as I said in that piece, it's like the Scarlet Letter. Hester Prynne,
Yeah.
the A, she's wearing as an adulterer.
Yeah.
But we wear the S. Is kind of this the segregated metropolis.
Yeah.
And I think it's become, in some ways, almost too easy an analysis. Here we have. They say that, so we kind of buy it. And in some ways, it's easy to, sometimes to believe the worst about ourselves, and that it certainly is an issue in Milwaukee. What I've argued, first of all, you look at the numbers, and depending on the index you use, and I am not giving Milwaukee a pass about racism. Certainly there is racism in our midst here. But in terms of the actual numbers, you have the index of dissimilarity, which measures how many blacks would have to move, to make it even through every census tract. We've been, number one, number two, we're always in the top few. If you use the isolation index, which measures the ratio of African Americans who live in areas that are at least 80% black, I think the last I looked, we were 2017. I think we were number 12. We have been number 5 before, so kind of down a bit in the ranks. So I think what's accurate to say is we are among the most segregated cities in the country, or metro areas, not cities, metro areas in the country, always in the same league as Chicago, St. Louis, Buffalo, Philadelphia, Detroit. And what they have in common is this sort of the northern industrial tier that attracted an awful lot of African Americans, to industrial jobs in the Great Migration. 1910, 1930 was the first phase. And the one thing, or more than one thing, that makes Milwaukee a little unusual is first of all, the geography of Milwaukee. We have Menominee Valley, kind of divides the city in half, the county in half. And that has always been kind of this dividing line between monolithic population elements. In the 19th century, it was Germans on the north side and Poles on the south side. Segregation was intense then too. So now it's African Americans on the north side and Latinos on the south side. Another factor was that largely because we had such a huge German population, in a lot of ways, the fact that you had a non-English language group in the majority here, that tended to help everybody else, Europeans, everybody else, to kind of preserve their cultures. So those were strong communities. And when you had racial change going on, they were resistant. As I said, when you have a strong sense of us, you'll have a strong sense of them, and that was very clearly operating in a lot of the north side neighborhoods, especially. But the biggest factor, I think, is that during the Great Migration, Chicago absorbed a huge share of rural sharecroppers moving north to take industrial jobs. And Milwaukee, until 1970, had the lowest proportion of African Americans in its population of any of the top 50 cities in the country. So relatively speaking, this was a small population. And what that meant was that it began a generation later than Chicago, and that's a generation less to generate a middle class and have people rise economically. And the timing couldn't have been worse. By 1970, Black males had a higher proportion of production jobs than white males. So this industrial town, this blue-collar factory town, union jobs, union wages, they're finally moving into those jobs and in a higher proportion than the white workers. And for the 1970s, that was a time of prosperity in Milwaukee's Black community. And then what happened is deindustrialization happens. And between 79 and 83, just 4 years, Milwaukee lost a quarter of its manufacturing jobs. And that, relatively speaking, was less severe damage than existed in other parts of the urban north. But last hired, first fired. So you have this catastrophic unemployment in the Black community. So when you look at it, you got maybe 15 years when Black workers were solidly in the middle class and staying there, and just you take this hatchet and you kind of take the bottom rungs of the ladder out. So you have unemployment, and with that unemployment came poverty. So what I've argued, and I think what the numbers show, is that the North Side's economy, especially, it was flattened and then frozen. And there has been, despite an awful lot of effort, no thorough resurgence, of an economic base. What does America do, with non-diplomaed, unskilled workers? It used to be factories, and you could take a job at A.O. Smith or Alice Chalmers and retire, with a good pension and high quality life. Those days are completely gone. So what has happened is that as there has been an erosion of economic power, there's an erosion of mobility, geographic mobility, so that the economic circumstances, and they begin, with kind of racist antecedents, kind of the neighborhoods redlining, and certainly the racial cuts, those sorts of things tend to pin down Blacks in certain neighborhoods, but then they can't move out. So there's no economic means to move out. So I've argued that kind of the fact that the community here was so young and began so late, relatively, that has aggravated the segregation patterns in Milwaukee.
Yeah, you it's interesting you mentioned the us versus them mentality, because one of the first things that I noticed when I moved to Milwaukee was just the pride that comes with their any culture and heritage. Like, there's all the different fests, which was a brand new experience for me, especially being from Seattle, where it's such a transplant over there. Right. And so all this pride over these unique, the culture and the heritage. Do you think that I think you kind of mentioned it. Do you think that those ties and the pride in their own history kind of influenced as well some of that maybe natural segregation that was happening?
Sure, absolutely. And again, if you have a strong sense of solidarity, when there's a perceived threat to that solidarity, geographic, especially in the case of the North Side, the racial chaining there, resistance. In cases where neighborhoods are autonomous, where there are less robust social networks, there'll be less resistance because there's not the organizational ties are not there. It has an impact. So it's a little, like many things about being human, things that can be positive also have a negative side. So you want a strong identity, you want to know who you are, you want to know where you came from, you want to know what your is. At the same time, that can lead excluding others, from the larger story.
Yeah, and I mean, but at the same time, now we know that you look at history, and there have been people who fought against that, right? That's the big premise of the civil rights movement. Well, I think it's easy to look back at kind of the civil rights movement as somebody in the north side of the country and think, oh, that was primarily a Southern issue, but that doesn't really accurately portray what happened, right?
It does not portray what happened, and I think there's some really interesting stories in Milwaukee's case. Certainly, slavery was endemic in the South, and we fought a civil war, based largely on the institution of slavery. But that does not mean by any means that the North was an oasis of racial understanding and acceptance. Racism has been a fact of life above the Mason-Dixon line as well. So there was probably the most celebrated case was Father James Grappi, who was a Bayview Italian. The 11th of 12 kids. Parents ran a general store that's still there, although it's no longer in the family.
Wow.
He was a priest at St. Boniface on the north side, which was a German parish, rapidly becoming African American. And he, in 1965, decided to go down to Selma, Alabama, voter registration drives, marching with Dr. King. And there were an awful lot of white clergy on the entire Christian spectrum and Jewish as well, going down to lend support to the movement to desegregate the South. And Grampi, like others, came home and realized the hypocrisy of Northern liberals who would go down south and try to confront those problems and ignore the ones in their own backyard. The fact that there were racist institutions and a great deal of racial disparity in the urban North. So I think within a year, he joined the NAACP and was head of its youth council. And that kind of moves into the Eagles Club, protesting against their Caucasians only membership policy when a majority, I think, of judges belong to the Eagles Club. Wow. Now, how can you judge fairly when you're saying African-Americans are not welcome and not fit to join your own institution? And that morphs into open housing and later into welfare marches. So you have, that certainly was kind of a watershed in Milwaukee history. But by no means, it was not just an Italian priest. You have Vel Phillips, who gets elected to the Common Council back in '56, and for 12 years is the only woman and the only African American on that council. And beginning in the '60s, she introduced an open housing ordinance, I think 4 times, to make it illegal to discriminate against on the basis of race for people trying to take housing, rental housing, and own housing as well. She was the only yes vote for all those years. So she was fighting kind of a lonely battle. Then you have another leader stands out in history is Lloyd Barbie, who was an African American lawyer, raised in Memphis. Educated in Madison, and he was in the state assembly when he led a group of blacks and whites suing Milwaukee public schools for providing unequal educations. And what he said was, it's I think a striking argument. The segregation was denying both black and white students an equal education, because the white kids were not being exposed to who was there, in the world. Right. They were being as isolated as the blacks. So he filed suit to desegregate back in 1965, and that had a very long fuse, but led to the desegregation of Milwaukee public schools in the late 1970s. So there was a lot of activity and a lot of activists, and by no means was it just the South. There was a lot going on in the urban North as well.
Yeah, and I mean, you're saying the 70s and 80s, which is kind of like shocking to me. As I wasn't born until the 90s, and so like to think that it's kind of just still an eye-opening thing when you hear that just as soon as a decade before I was born, those things are still being fought for. What do you think made their efforts so successful?
It was time. Simply, it was time, and time and then some. You have, I was just watching a show on Jackie Robinson a couple nights ago on PBS, and just the abuse, he had to take from some of the Southern ball players and coaches and managers and people sort of catcalling from the dugouts back in when he broke in, 1940s. No, the level of venom, back in those years is just hard to fathom. And I think there was finally an understanding that this is not human. No, it's not just not nice. It's not human. So you have reason prevailing, and I think it's that Dr. King quote: "The arc of the moral universe tends toward justice." People, I think, would argue that, but it certainly has over time, since the 1960s and 70s, proven to be the case. So we have become more in touch with the better angels of our nature, even though problems are still obviously very much there.
Right. Yeah, I think that's something it's easy to see, like you mentioned, the issues and the problems that we're currently facing, but at the same time, knowing that we have made progress,
right,
I think is an important thing to remember. But is there anything that you think we can learn from their example?
I think sometimes you have to do the unpopular thing. Now you look back and you have, 4th Street in Milwaukee is now North Vel Phillips Avenue. We've got the James Grampi Bridge, Lloyd Barbie School. So people who today are looked on as paragons of moral rectitude and people who did the right thing and did it effectively, they were completely controversial, during their times, unpopular, and
Yeah.
especially, in the white communities, kind of who are these people, who are trying to upset the status quo. And as time moves on and more people realize that the status quo was untenable, you couldn't continue with that level of intolerance and bigotry, then you say, oh yeah, they were right. So now we can own them. Now we can own them. So if there's a lesson, it is that if you see injustice, if you see things that are palpably wrong, do not hesitate to act and try to change them with as much energy as you have. So that's what they did. And see the Black Lives Movement and Black Lives Matter movement in the recent years, that was in some ways kind of a wake up call, but also kind of an affirmation, that sure, we thought things were going pretty well, but whoa, then Derek Chauvin leans on a black man's neck until he dies. We're not there yet. We have not reached, that promised land of equality and opportunity for all. So I think that's a lesson that we can carry from those early years. Controversy. Things are not done without controversy. Things are not done without ruffling feathers and upsetting the status quo.
Well, I really appreciated when you're talking about how the Civil War. We talk about slavery, and maybe it wasn't in the North, but the North still lacked racial understanding. I think that's such a good phrase because it speaks to, I think we still lack full racial understanding even right now. How important do you feel like it is to look at the history and the story of different cultures, different races to see, I need a better racial understanding. So I need to look back at history and see what really have you faced?
I'd say it's essential. I'd say it's indispensable. I think one thing I've always, the positive side of ethnicity, especially in a town like Milwaukee that takes such pride in its heritage, is that if you understand your own story, if you own your own story, you can go one of two ways. You can kind of cocoon yourself and say, I am, Polish or Ukrainian or Armenian, whatever you are, and that's kind of your whole identity. The other reaction or the other direction to go there is to say, I know my story, I own my story. It is one story among many that have created the American story. And I think it's pretty easy. In my case, it's stuff I love to do. Owning my own story has made me more curious about the stories of other groups, how they're different, how they're the same. But the categories, the trajectory is, they're the same. We're all human beings. We're all people. And seeing how you have the diversity in America, I think was one of our greatest strengths. But also, all those stories, kind of like tributaries of a river, kind of flow together to make one national narrative. Not without difficulty, not without disagreement, but that I think is the unique character and unique promise of the United States. So I think, yeah, learn as much as you can about who else is out there, because that's they are not. It's not just your neighbors. It's kind of they are threads just like you in the story that created America.
Have you seen people celebrate those things well?
At times, yes. I think in some cases it's more, it can be cliche. We're all in this together. The folk fair, I think is the holiday folk fair in Milwaukee, which I think is the oldest. They were on hold for a couple of years because of COVID. But I've been going to that since I was in diapers. That was my folks. my dad was Polish, my mom was Norwegian, both strongly invested in their own heritage. But the fact that you had all these groups, sharing their food, sharing their dances, sharing their culture, And the finale was always, this is back when now it's at the Panther Arena, it's now called. Finale was always all the groups, the dance groups, especially in their costumes, colorful costumes. They would, at the very end of the pageant, after all the dancers were through, they would pull this huge American flag that covered the floor.
Wow.
It was always moving, always powerful.
Yeah.
And I think that was in some ways aspirational. It's kind of how you want things to be, but
right.
in the moment you're feeling it. In the moment, they and the audience are saying, "Yeah, this is all many stories, e pluribus unum." That meant this, one from any of the states, but it could also mean all the ethnic groups. Cultural groups have made their homes here over the years. So yes, there have been kind of very, very concrete, tangible evidence of that. That is a message that resonates.
Well, it kind of shows that you can celebrate others, you can appreciate others without minimizing your own history and your own story. And
that's a line, I kind of heard from church in the last few weeks. Why should me living the fullness of my humanity diminish the possibility of you living the fullness of your humanity? Why can't they go together? Why can't we sort of own who we are and also respect who others are?
I love that. Well, John, thank you so much for joining me and chatting about this. I think it's really valuable, and I think looking back at history and gaining that understanding really allows us to move forward and figure out, hey, what can we do better? How can we work on these things? Now, if people want to read more on your stuff, they want to read the Making of Milwaukee, we can put a link in our description for anybody who wants to get that book. Do you like people to watch the documentary series or the book? Do you have a preference?
Both. It depends on your kind of your appetite for media. But the book Making Milwaukee, that's still in our 4th edition, and that by nature, because there's more stuff there. It's fourth edition that's sold about 28,000 copies. That's become, if only by default, kind of the standard history of Milwaukee, and that's I consider that kind of my big book. That's the one that sort of tells the story, in the latitude and the breadth that I wanted to. The TV show, that's now we updated it 6 years ago, 2016. But that's 5 hours of TV, and it won an Emmy, and it's a lot of that. The team we had was just superb. And that's still on the broadcast rotation to Channel 10. So that has struck a chord, that kind of remains. So that's in some ways a more immediate way of apprehending or comprehending Milwaukee's story. But I think both, depending on your taste, are useful.
Yeah, for sure. Is there any other books that you've released that touch more on the race elements?
Yeah, there's a book back in the 1980s. There was a series of posters about neighborhoods that the city of Milwaukee put out. I think we had 26 of them, and the front was a rendering of an architectural feature. They were wonderful. They were everywhere for a long time. On the back, I wrote an essay about the neighborhood's history, which is someone hung the poster. The words went away forever. So some of that was frustration, that these things were being hidden under a bushel. That back in about 2015, Historic Milwaukee Incorporated, which does a great job of kind of interpreting and publicizing our architectural heritage, especially. I worked with them to deliver a book called Milwaukee City of Neighborhoods, that features those posters. We added neighborhoods, I think there's 36 neighborhood essays, well illustrated. That won a graphic design awards. It's a really pretty book. Again, the team I work with. But there is, the divided north side, south side, east side, west side, and central. So there's the racial side of that story, in all those neighborhoods is treated in depth.
Well, we'll be sure to link that one as well for anyone that's really dying to know some more about Milwaukee history, and the amazing work that you've done and your team has done is really great. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. Thank you for asking, John. It was a pleasure to talk with you. Well, that was my conversation with John Gurda, and there's a lot to walk away with from that conversation. I think it's always helpful to leave that type of conversation and ask yourself, what did I hear? And how does that affect what I'm going to do moving forward? For me, I heard about just how easy it is to turn a strong sense of identity into an us versus them mentality. And so I think it's crucial for me to reflect on the words of Paul in Colossians 3:11, where he writes that there is no Greek or Jew, but only Christ in all. And then remember that my identity is a beloved child of God. And that's the same identity for all. Now, I just want to send a very special thank you to John Gurda for chatting with me. You can find a link to his books in the show notes, so be sure to check those out. And if this is a conversation that you think someone would find really helpful, share a link so that they can benefit from it too. And this is a great time to mention that we're also on YouTube now as well, so if you feel like a YouTube video would be more helpful, you can catch us there. Well, thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Podcast, and make sure to subscribe and follow so that you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations.